Okay, welcome back everyone. This is part 2 of our 3D modeling, procedural modeling tutorial. So, hopefully you've got something like what I've got here, one floor of a building. It could be, at the moment you might be copying what I do, but hopefully eventually you'll have your own piece of a building here and you'll start to do far more kind of interesting stuff than just my demonstrations. Okay, so I made one little change, which is I just went through and I named all of my objects here, just because it's a good habit to get into, to have things nice and tidy, rather than having a scene that has cube 0.01, cube 0.02, and so on. That just will be confusing for you later on. So it's good to have things named. So what we want to do is use this to make as many buildings as we want. So no more 3D modeling, we're just going to work procedurally now. So first of all, I'm going to turn our scene collection into something that allows that to happen. First, I'm going to select with Shift all of our building bits and the building itself, and I'm going to move them with the letter M to a new collection that I'll call Building Monomer. My favorite word, monomer. All right, so now we have this building monomer group, and if I untick that, the whole group will disappear. Okay, so now I'm just going to duplicate this collection, and I'm going to turn all of these into one object, and that's just going to help with our arrays. But we're going to keep the original monomer, because if we want to make any changes, we don't want to have to 3D model everything again, and especially when we're texturing things, keeping the original collection will be very, very useful. So I can either here just shift select things like that, or I can kind of grab them. But if I do that, you know, I'm getting the light and a bunch of other things. So I'll just shift select like that, and I'm going to press Control J. Now what that's done is it's joined it all into one object. Now you say to yourself, what is this awful flickering here? That flickering is because Blender is looking at both the joined object and our original group. And when you see flickering like that, it means that Blender, it's trying to show you in the viewport two things that are directly on top of each other, and it can't work out which face you should be looking at, so it's kind of showing you both and giving you that awful flickering that if you have that in a rendered animation, it will also look terrible. So we will just hide the original one. So our flickering's gone, and what we'll do is I don't really need this empty group anymore. I'm just going to left click and drag this back into the scene collection and delete, right click, delete that empty group. Okay, so building monomer 001. Now before we start to turn this into a building, I'll just press N to bring back my transformations. We want to reset all the transformations here so that the scale says 1, 1, 1. Our location and rotation is all set to 0 at the moment, which is good. But if I set these to 1 here, we're going to kind of go back to something probably close to our original cube, which is where we started this model. So Control Z. We don't want that. We want to say to Blender, okay, so what you see here, this is now the original. This is now the official scale. So we can set that scale by going into Object, Apply, Scale. And now you can see the scale is at 111, but the object hasn't changed. We can also get that menu by just hitting Control A, and we get the same thing here. And that's really important. Once we start to make copies of this, we really need to have the scale set so that the procedural aspects don't get confused by having a bunch of random numbers here. Okay, so now that we have our building monomer as one object, we can look at it and go, okay, great, all one object, lovely. Let's add an array. And an array is a modifier. We've got all these tabs here that we looked at a little bit in the first week, our rendering tabs and all that stuff. We've got a modifying tab here. And modifiers are an amazing way to do really powerful stuff in Blender without making permanent changes. Modifiers, we can make all of these temporary changes to objects, but still change the original object. And that's kind of the heart of working in a procedural manner. So, if I just duplicated this by hitting Shift D and then grabbing it on Z, sure, I could make lots of building levels, but it's kind of a pain and I have to do it one by one, and it's very difficult to make complex changes because I'm still making every building one by one. So I'm just going to delete those. Instead, I'm going to do it with an array. So I'll add a modifier. And so, sorry, the modifying tab here is the one with the little wrench, the spanner here. Add a modifier, an array modifier. And okay, now we have 2 buildings. And we can turn the count up, and we can have as many as we want. But we don't want our buildings stacked horizontally, we want them stacked vertically. So if we look into the offset, at the moment it's set to the x-axis with a factor of 1. So if I change that to 0 and change it to the z-axis of 1, hey, now we have a tower. Great. Now, if I look out my window, I think that building is, my building is 12 floors, so I think that building is probably 14 floors. It's just a little bit higher than mine. So I'll change the count to 14. Okay, cool. All right, there's my building. Now I'll just save what I'm doing. Good habit to get into. Okay, so now we have sort of 1/4 of our building. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the first tutorial, this building actually sort of has 4 quarters to it. It's not just 1/4 here. There's another bit of the building around here, and if I look out the window, it continues on the other side. So we need to make a second array, add another array modifier. But here you see, okay, we can make it go forwards and backwards, or side to side. But if we go side to side, it should be flipped over. This building should be sort of the opposite of this building. But we don't have that option here in the array modifier. But we can make our own solution. So instead of a relative offset, I'm going to untick that. We're going to have an object offset. And what that means is that we're going to use another object to determine the position of the second array. And that object is going to be what's called an empty object. So if I press Shift A to add, I'm going to add a plain axis, empty. And it's added it somewhere into the scene, probably where my 3D cursor is. If I go into wireframe mode, I can see my empty here. It's sitting over there. Let's just put it to 0. So it's at the origin. And now let's give it a name. Let's call it building empty 1. And I'll put it in the collection. Good place to put it. Now, I'll go back into shaded mode. And let's use that empty as the object for our array. So I'll go back into my building so I can see the array stack here. And now that I'm in object offset, I can see if on my list of objects to choose from, building empty 1 is there. So now I've selected that empty, but it doesn't look like much has happened. So let's move the empty and then see what happens. If I grab it and move it around, okay, so we have a second building that is sort of parented to this empty object. I'm going to right click to put it back where it was. Now let's think about what we want this object to do. We want to flip over our building. So I guess I could rotate it. I could rotate it on the z-axis, but that's not what I want. It's kind of, it might be the back quarter of the building, but it's not the other side. What we want to do is actually scale it. So if I scale it on the y-axis, then we can kind of see if I go that way and then grab it, we're getting kind of close, but I've done that in a very inaccurate way. I scaled it -7.2. Actually, we just want this to be -1. So if you scale something by -1, you're sort of just making a flipped version of it, a mirror image of it. Okay, but it's moved a little bit too far away. So if I look down from the top, we can see we've got these 2 L-shaped buildings, And with my building empty 1 selected, I'm just going to grab it on the y-axis and move it further together. We could work out the exact number where we should move it, and it's probably, that number is probably going to be half the length of this building, but I've just done a bit of a guess and I've moved it minus 14.93, but you know, it looks okay to me. Yeah, that'll be okay for now. Okay, great. So now we've got half of our building. So now we're just going to do the exact same thing and make the other half. So click on the building. I'll just collapse this array stack here, so it's not taking up so much space. If you run out of space down here, in Blender, a lot of the time you get kind of arrows between your windows, and that just means you can change their scale a bit. So I'll add another array modifier, and by default, it's another relative offset on the x-axis. So I'll untick that, make another, excuse me, another object offset. And this time, I'm just going to duplicate the first empty by pressing Shift D and then left clicking. And Blender has automatically called it building empty 1 underscore or .001. Blender will do that, you know, in case you make a mistake and have two objects with the same name. Blender will just add a number reference to make the names different. So I'll just change that to 2, building empty 2. Okay, so now we need to do the same thing again. I can grab this empty. Okay, I haven't set that in the array. That's why it's not doing anything. In the third array, I will grab building empty 2. And now if I move building empty 2, we've got the same thing happening again. So now I'm just going to set this scale of building empty 2 on the x-axis to -1. Now that's probably okay, but how is it on, if I grab it on the x-axis? Okay, yeah, so it's overlapping a little bit on the x-axis. So let's look from the top mode again, and let's just grab it on the x-axis and try to get it in a better position. Okay, great. So now we have a tower. Fantastic. Now, what we can do if I want to make a whole bunch of towers is I'll just press N and T to clear up my screen a bit. We can just add more arrays. And the great thing about arrays, as you've probably noticed, is that they multiply on top of each other. So what's happening with array 1 affects array 2 and array 3. So if I make a fourth one, we're starting to get entire buildings duplicated now. And if I just change the distance here and I raise this number up, look at that. We've got a whole lot of buildings, and I can do, let's do one more, another array, and instead of on the X, let's put that to the Y. Okay, and now I probably should move them a little bit apart. Okay, insert Hong Kong joke, they will never be that far apart, so let's make it like 1.2, and look, it's pretty close to what's outside my window now. So what we've done in this tutorial is we've 3D modeled just really one tiny part of a building. Like if I press tab, and tab should show me where my original building is. It's probably hiding somewhere in here. Where is my original? Okay, there it is. It's back in the corner somewhere. When you press tab and go into edit mode, it'll show you where the original building is. And if you want to change the original, you can do it a couple of ways. I can just make one change here. If I say, press E for extrude, click and grab it on the X and pull it out, it'll do that to every single building here. So that's pretty cool, pretty powerful. The other thing we can do later on, I might just undo that. So the other thing we can do later on is if I want to go back and do the texturing and make all the tiles and stuff like that, maybe we'll do that in another tutorial. I'll just hide my building monomer, so that'll hide everything. I can go back in here and make a change to one of these objects, and then in the next tutorial I'll show you that we can just make another copy join them together, and then we can just copy back over all of these array modifiers onto another version of that building monomer. So the great thing about working with arrays and modifiers is that we can go back and forth without having to undo any, or without having to redo any of this stuff. We kind of keep all of our different operations, and we can swap in new information very easily. So that's really cool. And you know, if you wanted to make a ground plane, like a street or something, you could do the same. Like if I add a cube here, add a cube, and well, maybe I'll just grab it on the y-axis and move it to somewhere where we can see it. I'll scale it up, S to scale, and I'll make it a bit more flat. Scale it on the z-axis and make it flat. You know, we could do something like press N and T to get my tools back. You know, I could, I don't know. I'm just cutting some things in here, and now I will grab some of these faces. This is a little bit random, but, and I can extrude these down. And you know, we could do something. I'll have to apply the scale, I could make a ground like this, you know, add another array, change that one to 1. And you know, we could make a kind of a ground object. If we were being more careful, we could make it so that it's the right size for our buildings, and so on and so on. But the point is exactly the same, that we can really, just by making one version of something, we can make lots and lots of copies. And once you've learned how to do something accurate like this, like accurate, I guess, in an observational sense, like the reason we have a reference image is to push us to look for even more details. You know, if we were going to keep going on this, as I said, I could add the air conditioners or add these beautiful kind of complex pipes. We could start to add the texture of the building, these brown tiles and these dirty white tiles. We could do a lot. But then we can move away from what's realistic and start to make things strange. You know, say if I grab one of these empties and I rotate it, as I showed you at the beginning, you know, things start to get pretty weird. I'll right click to undo that. Or I could scale it. You know, what if I scaled the first one? What's going to happen? You know, we can have buildings that all of a sudden are doing strange things. You know, what if I scale that just on the z-axis? We've got these growing buildings, and of course we can animate that. As I showed you in the first tutorial, if this is my empty, I could add in a keyframe and we could scale just one part of this. So if we work in this procedural way, we, on the one hand, balance our ability to learn 3D modeling, but we also balance the fact that we're working within a computer that is very good at adding and multiplying things together, so that we can get really amazing complex effects from very, very simple principles. Okay, so I'm going to finish this tutorial here, and we'll just see how long it takes for people to learn these abilities. And in class, I'm sure there'll be a lot of problems with this, a lot of difficulties and so on. So what I want you to do is make a note on your website of what problems you have, and then we'll discuss them in class and see if we can solve them together. And that's really how you're going to learn to be able to do your own things in Blender. As I said at the beginning of some of these courses, you might be copying what I do a lot, but really the goal is to have you make your own things and choose one variable, such as, you know, and something that you think will make it kind of cool and interesting and different, and start to make your own work. But yeah, all right, I'll stop the video there, and I look forward to workshopping this with you in class. Bye-bye.